Darren, thank you so much for being here today. Welcome to Stanford.
I'm delighted to be in Palo Alto at Stanford and not in Manhattan today. I can only tell you as a New Yorker, we often, when people abandon us and come out here, we lament that and say, how could they leave New York, the most exciting, interesting place in the world to live, and then you come here, and you completely get it. You completely get it. This place is magical.
Well, we have so much to talk about today, from your incredible life story to your time in leadership. But I want to start with where your story begins. Tell us about your upbringing and how it shaped you.
Well, I grew up in a country that believed that poor little boys who lived in shotgun houses on dirt roads in rural places like Ames, Texas, could dream. I had permission to dream. And so I had dreams. Some of those dreams took me away because I was in the first class of Head Start, and my love of words and language began then. And I would dream because there were occasions when my grandmother, who was a maid for a wealthy family in Houston, we would go in to the city, and I'd go to their house and help her with her work. But I would always, in their mudroom, find shelter magazines and books and programs from the Houston Ballet and the Alley Theater, and I would pilfer them away because they were throwing them away and bring them home with me. And I would sit and just go through the pages of these places and spaces that were so far away from that little dirt road in Ames, Texas, but it allowed my imagination to expand and to be taken out of the situation I was in, which would be probably called challenged, and to grow and I always felt, even though most people, when they look at the material circumstances of my childhood, would use the word poverty or deprived in some economic way, I always felt that my country was cheering me on. I always felt that America wanted me to succeed, and I always knew I was going to be a success. I didn't know that I was going to be president of the Ford Foundation because I didn't know what a foundation was. But I had enough support from my mother, who was a single mother of 4 kids. I never knew my father. And although she couldn't discern, well, you should go to this college or major in that discipline, she encouraged me, and she knew that I was a different boy. She knew that I was not like most of the other boys. And she completely embraced that. So my lovely, wonderful, departed partner of 26 years always spoke about how difficult it was to not feel that who you were as a child could be fully embraced. And the burden of that as an adult, I had the opposite. My mother knew that I was a strange child. And yet, she completely allowed me to flourish. And that helped. And then along the way, I just had people who were my champions. The thought of the cost of an education being a barrier for me was never a question. I was lucky to have scholarships, but I never thought about, oh my goodness, I'll have too much debt. to go to that school, and I went to public schools. I'm proud to say I have never had a day of private education in my life, and I think in a democracy that's a good thing when you have leaders who can say that. And so I've been a very lucky man. I've been very blessed. I was born at a time when I could dream. And the thing and the reason I'm so singularly focused on inequality today is because I want little boys and girls, wherever they are, if they're living in housing projects in the Bronx and they're black or brown, or they're living in rural towns that have been ravaged by opioids. I want them to be able to dream and to feel, as I did, that America wants you to succeed. Your country is enabling you to be a success and to get on the mobility escalator. And so that mobility escalator that propelled me forward has stopped for far too many Americans. And I think the fact that it has impacted our politics. And it has profound, I would say, existential implications and consequences for our democracy.
It is so powerful to hear you talk about the power of the American dream and the support that you had around you that helped you thrive and excel. But I also want to acknowledge that you've spoken about your experiences with racism and discrimination early in your childhood and into your career. How, and if you're open to sharing, how did you deal with and make sense of those experiences?
Well, I think anyone who is different, in whatever context, where you are a minority, can relate to what it feels like to be excluded or to be marginalized based on some marker. For me, racism was real because in the 1960s, growing up in a small town in Texas, it was just a way of life. And I think for a lot of people, it's so interesting because when I look at my mother's generation, it was an accepted cultural norm that you find in other parts of the world that, well, this is the way it is. It is. And so for my generation, the belief is a more hopeful one in this regard. I think hate is a scourge that many people feel is necessary. I mean, I say this as a historic, the kind of arc of history. Whether it's anti-Semitism or racism or classism. And I reject that idea, and I think those of us who do reject it have to be willing to speak up to reject it. And for me, I never let race or racism, and I say this often to young people and people today, throw me off my game. I think one of the things that people who are racist, just focusing on race, hope to do is to throw you off your game. And you really have to have clarity about your North Star and not be so consumed by the moment, right? So when I was a boy in this little town, I was in the 3rd or 4th grade, I guess, and this guy, friend, whatever, called me a sissy. I slugged him. We were on the floor fighting, and Mrs. Majors came and she pulled me off and she said, go into my classroom now. And I go into her classroom and I'm crying. I am a mess. And she says, Darren, you have to understand. Now again, Mrs. Majors would be probably fired today, but she was a great. She said, little Negro boys who cannot control themselves, bad things happen to them. Now, today, in this context, she was exhibiting love and care for me because she was helping me understand that in order for me to be a success, I had to control my anger and my rage. Mrs. Majors is on my shoulders every day. And so when you ask how I, over the years, have coped with, have thought about this, and when you talk to other successful people of color, certainly I can talk other successful blacks, that ability to cope with the moment in which you experience a racist interaction with someone, and the ability to not go there because it's so easy to, because for many it happens so often. That's key to your success because Mrs. Majors was right. The little Negro boys who simply might act out were put into the special education class. They were more likely to not graduate. And when you look at the prisons across this country today, those little boys are the primary occupants. And so Mrs. Majors did me a great favor. Yeah. She really loved me, and I owe her.
In the face of adversity, you thrived, becoming a corporate lawyer and then an investment banker. But not necessarily something you'd expect from someone who would go into philanthropy. What drove those early career choices?
Well, one of the things that happens when you grow up poor is, as an adult, you pledge to never be poor again. And so I was envious of my friends in law school who said, oh, I'm going to go and do this public interest law fellowship, and I'm going to go to the ACLU. I was very clear. I was going to make money. And clarity and purpose is so critical in life, but when you have goals that are short, medium, long term. So I knew that I would have responsibilities that many of my classmates did not. And so for me, going to Wall Street was a platform to create some wealth. That's all. And the psychic satisfaction that I did not experience was in some ways satiated during bonus season. And I reached a point where I said, I'm done. I mean, I did 10 years. And a lot of things converged. It was the early 90s. I had a life downtown in Manhattan, but if those of you who know New York in the 90s, I was really drawn to Harlem. Most people in New York in the 80s and 90s were not drawn to Harlem, which is hard today to imagine that there was a time when people did not want to live in Harlem. But when I moved to New York, a lot of people did not want to live in Harlem. And so I met this amazing minister at the Abyssinian Baptist Church, Calvin Butts, and he everything sort of converged, and I said, oh, great, I'm just going to come volunteer and hang out with you. And that's what I did. And the vision, which was a real regeneration of particularly central Harlem, although there were 500,000 people in Harlem, there was no supermarket, it was a food desert. In terms of healthcare, I mean, you could just go down the indicators of community well-being. And so we set about addressing that. And I spent 8 years there, and it was amazing. We did over 1,000 units of housing, the first supermarket in Harlem in 50 years. I mean, there were so many things that I got to be a part of, and it was great. And that transition allowed me, again, clarity and purpose. Yeah. When I left Wall Street, there were no regrets. I did what I sought and started out to do. And when I was able to transition to running a nonprofit in Harlem, I actually thought that I would want to do that kind of work. I mean, that specific work. I thought, well, I wanted to work in a black neighborhood. And I was drawn to Harlem because of the Harlem Renaissance, and I loved Zora Neale Hurston and James Baldwin and all these sort of sons and daughters of Harlem. And so I had this romanticized idea of course, when I moved to Harlem in the 1990s. I mean, there was not a lot of romanticism in the rats running around in my apartment and all that. It was a very different time than it is today. I mean, of course, when you go to Harlem now, and I mean, where do you start? The H&M, the Ralph Lauren. I mean, where do you start? I mean, with what populates 125th Street, as opposed to when I lived there, and just to get a quart of milk, you had to go to this bodega and hope that it hadn't expired.
Well, it's a really interesting decision you made to leave the corporate world, give away bonus season in Wall Street, because I think for a lot of us business school students, we sometimes have the perspective, I'm going to go into a field like investment banking, make a boatload of money, and then give it all away. What do you say to those of us with that perspective?
Good for you. I mean, I say, for just have clarity about what it is, and I didn't know when I started where I would end up, and I still don't know where I will end up because I'll be leaving Ford at the end of the year. But if literally you really want to make money, if you want to pay off your student loans, that's a goal. Set that goal. And the challenge is, and this is what I found in friends who later on in their careers would call me after really the sort of golden handcuffs are tightly around your wrists, to say, oh, I don't like being a partner at the law firm, or oh, I'm tired of IPOs and chasing clients, or whatever. All right, well, you're 45, 50 years old. I mean, you spent 20 years. You can't just pivot and say, well, because now I think I want to be like you. I think I want to go and be in a foundation. Well, you can't pivot. You've been at Goldman for 20 years doing this kind of work, and you're not a billionaire. I mean, so it's not like, you're just going to sit and not work and give away money. I mean, if you're that, I mean, it's this is the more normal thing where people just have become accustomed to a lifestyle. I mean, in a place like New York, it is a place where, you can have a household income of $1 million and not feel particularly rich. I mean, when if you have a nice apartment, you want a house in the Hamptons, $1 million a year is not going to get you that in New York. And so people get the handcuffs and the lifestyle, and then you've got kids, and then you've got private school education, and then and all of a sudden, and you're really not happy doing that work anymore, but you're locked into a lifestyle. And so I think figuring out earlier, because the longer you stay in that example, the harder it is to extricate yourself into, and pivot. Now, it's not, if you're an investor and you want to go and do impact investing, or sure, that's not, but the kinds of big pivots, certainly that I did, are possible because I think I got out at the right time.
I think that's a great call for us to each find our clarity and what we'd like to do. So you take that clarity, a passion for social impact, and you go to Rockefeller, where you spend quite a bit of time before you move on to the Ford Foundation. And 3 years in, you're asked to lead the organization. What did that mean to you?
Well, I think I've never been foundation material, or certainly not. No, when I interviewed at Rockefeller, I remember I went back for so many interviews. And I would remember I'd take the A train back to Harlem and think, well, what just happened? Are they going to hire me or not? And I just kept getting called back, but never an offer. And then I got an offer. And a few months in, a person who was a director, one of the directors, I was hired as director of the U.S. program. That was but the director of the Africa program. We were talking, and he said, do you know, a lot of people during the interview process liked you, but they just didn't think you were Rockefeller material. And the reason for that was because and at Rockefeller at the time, I wasn't an academic. I'd never published anything in a journal. I didn't go to private school. They were right. By that criteria, I was not. I didn't, the other 4 directors all had PhDs. One was a Rhodes Scholar. They were, Now, 2 years later, I was promoted to vice president, and I was their boss. And so, what happened, right? And so that to me is the lesson. And part of the lesson is there was a time when, and I can say this because it's true, there was a time when the smartest man in the room was presumed to be a leader. But it's just because he's a Rhodes Scholar, he's the first professor in the Department of Economics to blah, or whatever, he's the youngest partner at. What we now know, and certainly from research, but anecdotally, is those people are usually not leaders. And they usually are not equipped. I should say they are often not equipped with what it takes to lead, inspire, energize, mobilize, manage, create followership, innovate, et cetera, that is needed to lead in the complex world we live in. And so that's what happened to me at Rockefeller. And that's what happened at Ford. I have never been the smartest man in the room. And that has never left me feeling inadequate or not up to the task. Because at every opportunity, when given a chance to lead, I've been able to do that. Yep. And so things accrete. Reputation accretes. Your own personal brand and how people experience you, you hope accretes. But to lead today, you have to have some sense of humility, of empathy for others, an ability to put yourself in their shoes. Now, that doesn't mean that every leader today possesses that. But I do think to be the kind of leader who is respected and hopefully admired, not because of your title, because that's the other thing about there are many people with president behind their name or founder behind their name. It doesn't mean that they're respected, that they're admired, that they have a followership that comes not because of their title, but because they inspire, because people want to be in the room with them and are willing to follow them because they respect them. And so I try my best, and I don't always succeed, in being that kind of a leader.
I want to touch on that point about humility. But before I get there, at the Ford Foundation, you chose to make the mission about addressing one core issue, inequality. And I think we can all agree in this room how important that is to give everyone hope, to level the playing field, to make sure that everyone has a fair shot. Yet since 2020, the world's 5 richest men have gotten twice as wealthy, while 5 billion people across the world have gotten poorer. What's not working?
Well, first, I think it's important to not demonize wealthy people. My quest to engage in questions of inequality is not about demonizing people who are successful. We need people to be innovative, to be innovators, to be entrepreneurs, to make the potential of capitalism and our economic system to generate wealth. We need that, and that's where I begin. Having said that, for a democracy, I'm not talking about other forms of government or other countries, for this country, with the history of a nation where the mobility escalator, our ideas of opportunity, hope, are the lodestar of our cultural zeitgeist. To not have an economic system and a form of capitalism that does not produce shared prosperity is a potential crisis. And so the question is not about, well, there's 5 people and now they're richer. The question for me is, how do we have a system where people do what we have always done in this country? And little boys like me get to grow up like, work hard, have a fair, level playing field, have a culture and an economic system that allows people to dream. That is a function of government and public policy, choices that are made. That is a function of what we prioritize in our larger collective ambition for us as a country. And so for me, I think we've got to question the systems and structures that are designed to generate these outcomes. Because if we believe in the values of this country, of opportunity, of hope, inequality is the enemy of hope. Because hope is the oxygen of democracy. And when you have a society where there is hope and opportunity, the air is full.
Yeah.
And when you have a society where hope, where inequality is growing, that hope is asphyxiated. And the air becomes toxic because the citizenry believe that the systems, the institutions, the economy are all stacked against them. And they become angry and anxious and resentful. And all of that is bad for a democracy.
So some people, in tackling these issues, argue that instead of philanthropy, corporations and individuals should just pay higher taxes. And you've got folks on the other side who say that, well, the private sector is a more transformative place for change. How do you respond to those who maybe don't see a place for philanthropy in society?
Well, first of all, I think it's a false binary. And philanthropy can never make up for the consequences of inequality, what I'm talking about. The problems that we have to solve in the world today, philanthropy can't make up for that. And the private sector has an incredibly important role to do in solving the world's problems. And there is much to be unleashed in the private sector. It is not simply about saying to wealthier people, pay your taxes or pay higher taxes, or let's just tax them. Actually, I do think there's a question about whether our tax system is fair. And I have lived with privilege, and I have lived without privilege. And there is a big difference. To live in a world of privilege, when I was an associate, I just joined the law firm, and when you join the firm and they give you the orientation, they give you all of your materials, and there's one to open your banking, and there's a letter and please go to 55 Wall Street to this. I'm so old. It was First City National Bank, now Citibank, and take this. So I'm young and clueless, and I just go walk in, and I'm standing in line, and this lady sees, and I said, oh, and I show her this, and she said, oh, sir, you're in the wrong line. And she takes me up these stairs to this place, and there was a sign, and it said, private bank. We go inside, and I sit down with a banker, with a person, and they begin to tell me the suite of opportunities in the private bank. Well, my mother lived on a precipice. The idea of even writing a check and it bouncing was a reality, that was just a cloud over our household. And to sit with someone and to say, well, in the private bank, basically we'll let your checks bounce. That you put some money in this account and we will. I just thought a bank was a bank. I didn't understand that there was another whole bank for people like me. And thus began my journey, where you come to just see that for people with privilege and money, there's just another line. There's just another whole line. Yeah. And because I had been in that other line, and now I'm in the other line, and I see how different it is. And I see how, just how you just invest. And have you been lucky enough to own assets, in the last decade or even since 2020? If you've owned securities, if you've owned real estate in New York or the Hamptons, or just think about the things in my world or my milieu, we just had to sit there. We didn't have to do, we worked hard and we whatever, but you just would just open your bank statement and your Morgan Stanley private bank account statement once a quarter. And it's amazing.
Yeah.
And at the same time, so many people in this country feel, like my cousin, who I used to babysit for, who lives in rural Louisiana. And his dream has been to have a double-wide manufactured home. And I'm helping him finance it. But the journey to get there, the journey to get him there, work hard, play by the rules, do all the things you're supposed to do. And all he wants is his double-wide mobile home. And then people complain in my world that their Range Rover was delivered late, and they're really mad about it.
As you think about tackling this issue of fixing those two lines or bringing them together, you're faced with difficult decisions every day about where to give money. Is it fighting homelessness in America, or is it tackling starvation in war-torn regions? How do you decide who deserves a grant and who doesn't?
Well, you first have to start with a clear vision, mission, and strategy that allows you to have some rigor around what you invest in that correlates with some objective you have longer term. And so at the foundation, our work has significantly been around issues of social justice and inequality. And so for that reason, our work has been focused on economic rights and justice issues. And so an example would be, in terms of strategy and grant making, I believe that a critical link to the mobility escalator is ownership. We should be an ownership society. We have become less of an ownership society because of the choices that have been made. And so we make grants to organizations working on employees having ownership and equity.
Yeah.
And so there are models for that, from ESOPs to employee stock ownership programs to a program we have with KKR working in their domestic portfolio with ownership in many of their manufacturing portfolio companies. Because if people have equity, they have more of a commitment, they are better workers, they are more productive. My grandfather had a third-grade education. He was a shoe shine boy, which is what they called him in the 50s, and the porter in an oil company in Texas. But every employee participated in the profit-sharing plan. Even the porter, when he retired, his Social Security check and his stock in the company allowed him to live with dignity for the rest of his life. Those programs don't exist anymore. Why? Well, because we made choices to do away with those programs. So we, in that economic justice program, make grants to organizations working on that kind of initiative. In our work on reproductive rights and justice, we are unapologetically, as a foundation, pro-choice and believe that a woman has a right to determine bodily autonomy and the right to an abortion. That there are many organizations who are working towards that objective. We fund those organizations. And so we make, through those strategic choices, then cascading down a set of choices among organizations we believe are most likely to help contribute to that progress towards those goals.
As you speak to a room of young people, I'm reminded of your quote that you find hope in young people. As you pass the baton, it's on our generation to take up the mantle. What is your call to action for our generation?
Well, first, I say, I apologize. Because we should be passing a better world to you. And so learn from the lessons of the people whose shoulders you stand on.
Yeah.
And when it comes to issues of injustice, of fairness, of opportunity, help correct the things that you think are wrong and need fixing, of which there is a lot.
I certainly hope that each of us will take that away and figure out what we can fix and move towards that. This is your last year at the helm of the Ford Foundation. And so before we open it up to Q&A, I find it particularly fitting that our theme for the year is leaving your mark. So Mr. Darren Walker, how would you like to be remembered?
Well, I would like to be remembered as someone who was less concerned about leaving a mark than impacting people. And what I mean by that is by being an example that you can certainly not be what might be presumed, that you can be a complex person, right? And your complexities and being sort of multidimensional and complicated are all seen as values and virtues towards your leadership. And so, you know, I'm not big on legacy talk. When I when the board chair called, we did it all hands on, sort of in a room like this at the Ford Foundation, and we were on stage like this, and he said, "We have bittersweet news. Darren has told the trustees that he's going to leave next year," and he went on to say, "And it's going to be so hard to fill his shoes." And then during the Q&A, the staff were like, "Oh, it's going to be so hard to fill your shoes." And finally, I just took the microphone and said, "I am taking my shoes with me." It is not about my shoes.
Yeah.
My shoes are leaving the building. The board, you need to find the next pair of shoes or pumps that need to be in this seat. But, you know, I'm just not, I get really uncomfortable. I mean, we just, you know, they literally are planning my going away party, and I was like, are you kidding me? Like, there are going to be 2 speakers, the board chair and me. It's going to be an 8-minute program. I am not speaking on behalf of the women's rights movement, speaking on behalf of the LGBT, speaking on behalf of, oh my gosh, that's a dreadful experience that I go through all the time. But I mean, and it's fine, but it's just, it's so not. And I get it. Oh, yeah. But like, like get on, get out of the way, let other people come along. And, you know, one of my mentors was this amazing man named Vernon Jordan. And Vernon used to say to me, work until you can't, and live in the future. And that was such great. So I don't look back and, we're gonna, yes, you know, there are times when I do. I mean, you know, but look to the future. Be excited. Get busy.
Well, if I can say so myself, Darren, you leave behind a tremendous legacy and huge shoes to fill. We'll now open it up to audience Q&A. If you could just raise your hand, our mic runners and VFTT team will come to you. Please just state your name and your year before asking your question.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm Sarah. I'm an MBA 1, and I've been thinking a lot about Bloomberg's decision to cover the U.S. commitment to the Paris Agreement. And I'm curious how you think the role of philanthropy is changing now in the next 4 years and then beyond.
Well, as a full disclosure, I'm on Mike's board of the company of Bloomberg LP, and I'm a huge admirer of his, obviously. And I think this isn't his first rodeo on the issue of Paris and the U.S.'s withdrawal. And so he's got a playbook, and that playbook was successful, I think, in the first administration of this president, and I think he's going to deploy it. I do think in that example, Mike is putting a tremendous amount of his personal wealth towards ensuring participation in the resources. And so in that example, it is an example where the financial resources, a philanthropist, because it's a window and it can't solve the problem, but the challenge that of America and American institutions participating and having the resources to do that will be spoken to. I think the question of the leadership of us as a country represented in the world, no philanthropy can make up for that. But I think Mike is an example, and there are others who can step in when there is a bottleneck, when there is a time-limited challenge, and with a tremendous amount of resources, make a huge difference.
Thank you. I'm June. I'm an MBA 1 here. While doing international developments, how do you handle unpredictable or even hostile reactions from foreign governments? Especially last summer when President Ruto made unreasonable accusations of Ford Foundation, the tension escalated. And then you two met in New York, I think in September, and suddenly the president was like praising Ford Foundation. What did you do?
I think first of all, when you are an American-based institution, one of the things and you've been in a place like East Africa, or many parts of the world we are in, you experience the growing agency that countries that we used to call developing countries rightly feel. So there was a time when American institutions, including the Ford Foundation, had a pretty colonial mindset in our development work in these countries. And they rightly won't tolerate that any longer. And I think that's a good thing. Having said that, you also can be a piñata for authoritarians and people who, when things in their own country are not going well, are looking for someone or some institution or some country to blame. And I think President Ruto was in a very difficult situation. And I admire him, and I think he and I just needed to sit down and have a conversation about our shared interests. And you have to also understand that for a lot of leaders on the continent, sitting down with a black person from America representing an American institution as its CEO is a new experience. Of course, we have President Obama as the ultimate black CEO. But for a lot of these leaders, there is something that allows you to have a shared experience that you can speak to.
All right, we'll take one last question.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, my name is Grace Pan. I was wondering if you could provide us with an update on the mission investments portfolio. I know that the Ford Foundation is famous for placing a $1 billion bet on impact investing, expecting financial returns as opposed to grant making. So I'm wondering, how has the performance of the fund changed your view on impact investing?
Well, thank you. That's a great question. And it has affirmed my view because when I proposed the idea, there was some skepticism among the trustees, understandably, because they operated from a perspective of we should have the endowment generate as much return as we can, and then you'll have more money to give away. Of course, you know, sidebar, when I asked for, when we first reorganized the foundation around inequality and some of the issues that I spoke to, I wanted an audit of the portfolio, the endowment portfolio. And this is when you hold the mirror up to yourself. You know, when sometimes it's easy. We foundations are great at pontificating from our glass houses, and we literally have a glass house at the Ford Foundation, about what. And then you hold the mirror up and you find that not only are you the largest grant maker in ending private prisons and the prison industrial complex, you also find that you're an investor in it. That's news that is a part of the journey of this idea from generosity to justice. Dr. King said about philanthropy the following: philanthropy is commendable, but it should not allow the philanthropist to overlook the economic injustice which makes philanthropy necessary. So that's what he was talking about. You are happily investing in improving the public health of people in this community, and you're investing in one of the largest contributors to asthma rates. So the mission investment portfolio has affordable housing, financial services for the poor as two primary objectives and asset classes. It's done very well. Surprise, surprise, affordable housing, you can make money in America. Now, it's true, the IRR does not look like luxury housing, but we have a different strategy to have both an attractive adjusted rate of return and social impact. And so the portfolio, which is now the original billion, well over half invested, has done very well. And we published, and I think it may be on our website, an evaluation, I think when we were maybe at the 350 or 400 mark. But I'm very encouraged and hopeful that we will continue to experience success and that it will grow. Thank you.
So Darren, we have a tradition here at View from the Top where we like to wrap up every interview with a set of rapid fire questions.
Okay.
So I'm going to throw out a question and you're going to tell me whatever comes to mind. Are you ready?
Are you sure that's a good idea?
We'll see. We'll see.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Absolutely.
What's the most important piece of advice you ever received?
Mrs. Major's advice that I've told you about was the best advice ever.
What's one thing most people don't know about you?
There's so much. Most people would be surprised to know that I have moments of real sadness. Partly because of, this isn't a rapid fire answer, but because when my partner of 26 years died 6 years ago, a lot of things in my life became dark. And there is something that happens, and if you have ever lost a spouse, a child, there is a part of you, no matter how light-filled you are, where there is just darkness that you can never seem to get rid of.
Thank you for being willing to share that with us. You're also the president of the National Gallery of Art, in addition to being president of the Ford Foundation. What is your favorite piece of artwork?
Oh my goodness, my favorite piece of art. That's a really hard question. I can only answer with
Only
one.
Only one.
Oh no. My favorite piece of art. Oh, because there's so many. All right. So I would say Manet's Olympia.
Okay.
Manet's Olympia, because it's the foundational picture of modern art, and because it was so shocking when it was shown in Paris. So this courtesan lounging naked and looking into the eyes of Manet unapologetically, and being handed a beautiful bouquet of flowers from her client or next caller. It's a really amazing picture.
And what's the first thing you're doing when you retire?
The first thing I'm doing
First thing.
is to hopefully take a little time off, hopefully.
Yeah.
So I'll do my version of I'm going to Disney World.
Well, Darren, I can't wait for you to go to Disney World. It's been an absolute honor to have you here at View from the Top. Thank you so much. Thank you.